Millionaire sues neighbors over community garden. Judge's verdict changes neighborhood forever. Hello. Welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. Imagine waking up one morning to the sound of silence, only to have it shattered by a knock on your door. Rachel, a woman whose hands have nurtured the very roots of her neighborhood's community garden, opens the door to find her world turned upside down. A lawsuit. Not just any lawsuit, but one filed by the man who lives in the mansion across the street. The man who has never set foot in the garden, never cared about the people who depended on it. But now, he wants it all gone. Just like that. This garden isn't just soil and flowers, it's hope. It's where children laugh, where the elderly find peace, and where generations have shared stories and built memories. Rachel has a choice. Give in to the pressure and watch her community's heart be ripped out, or stand up against a man who has the power to destroy everything she's ever loved. The stakes? Everything. As the courtroom battle looms, secrets begin to rise from the past. Secrets that no one was prepared to face. Can one woman's fight for justice save a community, or will power and greed crush the very soul of the neighborhood? One thing's certain. By the end of this fight, nothing will ever be the same. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when the first rays of light crept across Maple Grove, a quaint suburb just outside of Philadelphia. The early morning silence was oppressive, thick with tension that hung in the air like a heavy fog. In this moment of eerie calm, two worlds were about to collide. Richard Harrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his sprawling mansion, a cup of artisanal coffee clutched in his manicured hand. His steely gaze fixed upon the community garden next door, his lip curling in disgust. To him, it was nothing more than an eyesore, a blight on his meticulously curated view. The weeds, the mismatched plants, the weathered benches, all of it offended his sense of order and control. As Richard seethed, his thoughts drifted to the impending legal battle. Today was the day he would finally rid himself of this nuisance. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he imagined the satisfaction of turning that patch of land into an extension of his perfectly manicured lawn. Across the street, in a modest two-story home with peeling paint, Rachel Johnson's alarm clock blared to life. The 52-year-old African-American woman groaned, her body aching from years of hard work. She moved slowly, each joint protesting as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Rachel's gnarled hands trembled slightly as she reached for the framed photo on her nightstand. Her mother's warm smile beamed back at her, a bittersweet reminder of all she had lost. Tears welled up in her eyes as she traced her mother's face with a calloused finger. "I miss you, Mama," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish you were here to tell me what to do." With a deep breath, Rachel steeled herself for the day ahead. She had work to do in the garden, her sanctuary, before facing whatever challenges lay ahead. The community garden had been the heart and soul of Maple Grove for generations. It was more than just a plot of land. It was a living, breathing piece of history. Rachel's great-grandmother had tended these very rows during the Great Depression, feeding not just her family but the entire neighborhood. During the civil rights movement, it had been a gathering place for activists and a symbol of unity in the face of adversity. For Rachel, the garden was her last connection to a past that seemed to be slipping away with each passing day. Since her mother's death 2 years ago, she had poured her grief and love into every seed she planted, every weed she pulled. The garden had become her therapy, her purpose, and her legacy. As Rachel stepped out onto her porch, the cool morning air nipped at her skin. She inhaled deeply, savoring the earthy scent of damp soil and blooming flowers. The quiet was almost peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of unease that she couldn't shake. With determined steps, Rachel made her way across the street to the garden. Her fingers tingled as they brushed against the weathered gate, a familiar comfort in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. She knelt in the soft earth, ignoring the protest of her aging knees, and began to work. Time seemed to stand still as Rachel lost herself in the rhythmic motions of gardening. The world around her faded away, replaced by the soothing sensation of soil between her fingers and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. For a few precious moments, she found peace. The spell was abruptly broken by the crunch of gravel under tires. Rachel looked up, squinting against the morning sun, to see an unfamiliar car pulling up to the curb. Her heart began to race as a man in a crisp suit stepped out, a leather briefcase in hand. "Ms. Johnson," the man called out, his voice clipped and professional. "Rachel Johnson?" Rachel stood slowly, wiping her hands on her faded jeans. "Yes, that's me," she replied, anxiety creeping into her voice. The man's expression was impassive as he approached, extending an envelope toward her. "You've been served," he stated flatly, pressing the document into her trembling hands. Rachel's world tilted on its axis as she stared at the official seal on the envelope. With shaking fingers, she tore it open, her eyes scanning the legal jargon until they landed on the words that made her blood run cold. Richard Harrison versus the residents of Maple Grove. The shock hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet. Richard Harrison, the reclusive millionaire whose mansion loomed over their modest homes, was suing them, all of them, for the garden. As the reality of the situation sank in, Rachel's mind raced. How could they fight this? Richard had endless resources, a team of high-powered lawyers at his disposal. The residents of Maple Grove were mostly working-class families, retirees on fixed incomes, and single parents struggling to make ends meet. The garden wasn't just a hobby. For many, it was a vital source of fresh produce in a neighborhood where the nearest grocery store was miles away. It was a place where children learned about nature, where elderly residents found purpose and companionship. To lose it would be to lose the very heart of their community. Tears burned in Rachel's eyes as she looked around at the flourishing plants, the result of years of love and care. How could she tell her neighbors that it might all be taken away? The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders, threatening to crush her spirit. With trembling legs, Rachel made her way back to her house. She needed to think, to plan, to find a way to fight back. As she entered her living room, her gaze fell upon an old, battered lockbox tucked away on a high shelf. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Rachel, baby, there might come a day when you need what's in here. It's our history, our truth. Don't you ever let anyone take that away from you." With a surge of determination, Rachel retrieved the box and opened it with reverence. Inside, yellowed with age but still legible, was a document she had only seen once before. The original deed to the land, proving that it had once belonged to her family. As she held the fragile paper in her hands, a spark of hope ignited in Rachel's chest. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about reclaiming a legacy that had been unjustly stolen decades ago. The silence of the morning was shattered by the sound of car doors slamming and raised voices. Rachel peered out her window to see her neighbors gathering in the street. Confusion and anger etched on their faces as they compared the legal notices they had received. In that moment, Rachel knew what she had to do. With the deed clutched to her chest like a shield, she stepped out onto her porch to face her community. The battle for the soul of Maple Grove was about to begin, and Rachel Johnson would be damned if she didn't fight with everything she had. As she looked into the worried faces of her friends and neighbors, a single thought echoed in her mind. How can we stand against the power of a millionaire and a history buried in injustice? Little did Rachel know the answer to that question would change their lives forever. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Maple Grove, Rachel found herself sitting at her worn kitchen table. The ancient deed spread before her like a fragile treasure map. Her fingers traced the faded lines of her family name, Johnson, inked onto the yellowing paper decades ago. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders as memories of her mother's stories flooded back, each one a piece of a puzzle she was only now beginning to fully understand. "Chile, this land has stories," her mother's voice echoed in her mind, tinged with both pride and sorrow. Stories that some folks would rather forget. Rachel closed her eyes, allowing herself to be transported back to muggy summer evenings on the porch, her mother's rich voice painting vivid pictures of a time long past. The Johnsons had been one of the first black families in Maple Grove, having purchased their plot in the early 1900s when the area was still largely undeveloped. For years, they had cultivated the land, turning it into a thriving farm that helped feed the growing community. But as the suburbs expanded and property values soared, Powerful interests set their sights on the Johnson land. What followed was a dark chapter in Maple Grove's history, a tale of corruption, intimidation, and injustice that saw not just the Johnsons, but several other black families stripped of their property through a combination of legal manipulation and outright fraud. They came with papers and promises, her mother had said, eyes distant with pain. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. We lost everything but this little house. The community garden had been born from the ashes of that injustice, a small act of defiance and healing. The displaced families with nowhere else to go had banded together to cultivate the patch of land that nobody else wanted. Over time, it had become a symbol of resilience and a testament to the strength of community. As Rachel sat lost in thought across town, Richard Harrison was ensconced in the plush confines of his home office. The room, with its mahogany panels and leather-bound books, reeked of old money and power. Richard leaned back in his ergonomic chair, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he listened to his lead attorney, James Whitaker, detail their strategy over the speakerphone. "It's an open and shut case, Richard," Whitaker's voice crackled through the line. "The property records clearly show you as the legal owner. These people have been squatting on your land for years. We'll have them out in no time." Richard's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Excellent, James. I want this wrapped up quickly and quietly. That eyesore has been a thorn in my side for far too long." As he ended the call, Richard swiveled his chair to gaze out the window at the disputed land. To him, it was nothing more than another business transaction, another asset to be acquired and disposed of at will. The lives that would be affected, the history that would be erased, these were mere footnotes, insignificant details in the grand scheme of his ambitions. Little did Richard know that his actions were about to stir up ghosts long buried, setting in motion a chain of events that would force him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own past and the true cost of his wealth. Back in her kitchen, Rachel's reverie was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find Sarah Chen, her next-door neighbor and fellow gardener, standing on the porch with worry etched across her face. "Rachel, have you seen this?" Sarah asked, holding up her own copy of the lawsuit notice. "What are we going to do?" Rachel took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "Come in, Sarah. I think it's time I shared something with you, with all of our neighbors. This fight, it's about more than just the garden." As Sarah settled at the kitchen table, Rachel carefully unfolded the old deed. "This land," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "It has a history that goes back further than any of us realized, and I think it might be the key to saving our community." Over the next hour, as more neighbors trickled in, drawn by the urgent whispers spreading through Maple Grove, Rachel recounted the painful history of the land. Gasps of shock and murmurs of anger filled the small kitchen as the full extent of the injustice was revealed. "So you see," Rachel concluded, her eyes shining with unshed tears, "this isn't just about a garden. It's about righting a wrong that's been festering for generations. It's about reclaiming what was stolen from our families." The room fell silent as the weight of Rachel's words sank in. Then slowly voices began to rise, some angry, some afraid, but all united in the realization that they were facing a fight that went far beyond a simple property dispute. "But how can we possibly win against someone like Richard Harrison?" asked Tom Gallagher, an elderly widower who had tended the garden for decades. "He has more money than all of us combined." Rachel's gaze swept across the room, taking in the diverse faces of her neighbors, young and old, representing various ethnicities and backgrounds, all bound together by their love for their community. In that moment, she felt a surge of determination unlike anything she had ever experienced. "We may not have money," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "but we have something Richard Harrison can't buy, the truth, and we have each other. This garden has been our strength for years. Now it's time for us to be its strength." As nods of agreement rippled through the gathered neighbors, Rachel realized that they were standing at a crossroads. The path ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and uncertainties. But for the first time since receiving the lawsuit notice, she felt a glimmer of hope. "So," she asked, looking around at the determined faces surrounding her, "who's ready to fight for our home?" The chorus of affirmations that followed was like a battle cry, echoing through the small house and out into the streets of Maple Grove. The first seeds of resistance had been planted, and Rachel knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the impromptu meeting broke up, with neighbors heading out to spread the word and begin organizing their defense, Rachel found herself alone once more. She stood at her kitchen window, gazing out at the garden that had become the center of this brewing storm. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I hope I'm doing the right thing. I hope I'm strong enough for this fight." A warm breeze rustled through the garden, carrying with it the sweet scent of blooming flowers. To Rachel, it felt like a sign, a gentle reminder that she was not alone in this battle. With renewed purpose, she turned away from the window, ready to take the first steps on what promised to be a long and challenging journey. Little did she know that across town, Richard Harrison was about to receive a phone call that would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. A call that would force him to confront long-buried truths about his own family's past and the true origins of his wealth. The stage was set for a clash that would reverberate through Maple Grove, unearthing secrets, challenging loyalties, and ultimately testing the very fabric of the community. As the sun began to set on this tumultuous day, one thing was certain: nothing in Maple Grove would ever be the same again. The next morning dawned with an electric tension in the air, as if the very atmosphere of Maple Grove was charged with the impending conflict. Rachel woke early, her mind racing with plans and worries. As she stepped onto her porch, steaming mug of coffee in hand, she was surprised to see a flurry of activity in the usually quiet neighborhood. Neighbors were gathered in small groups, talking in hushed but urgent tones. Some were putting up homemade signs in their yards. "Save Our Garden" and "Community Overgreed" dotted the landscape like colorful battle flags. The sense of unity was palpable, a stark contrast to the isolated lives many had led before this crisis brought them together. Across town in his sprawling mansion, Richard Harrison was already at work. His home office had been transformed into a war room, with his team of high-powered lawyers surrounding him like generals planning a campaign. "I want that land cleared by the end of the month," Richard barked, his voice cold and determined. "Use whatever means necessary. I don't care about their sentimental attachment to a bunch of weeds." James Whitaker, his lead attorney, nodded solemnly. "We've already put pressure on the city council. They're set to vote on revoking the garden's temporary use permit next week. Once that's done, we can move in immediately." Richard smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "Excellent. These people need to learn that you can't stand in the way of progress. And progress, gentlemen, is whatever I say it is." As the meeting adjourned, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made him pause. Sarah Harrison, his estranged sister. With a mix of curiosity and annoyance, he answered. "Richard," Sarah's voice was tight with emotion, "I just heard about what you're doing in Maple Grove. You can't go through with this." "And why is that, dear sister?" Richard's tone dripped with sarcasm. "Because..." Sarah hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Because that land has a history that involves our family. Dad, he wasn't always the upstanding businessman you think he was." Richard's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "I found some old documents in Mom's things after she passed. Richard, our family's wealth, it's built on stolen land. Land that belonged to the very people you're trying to drive out now." The phone slipped from Richard's hand, clattering to the desk. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt. Meanwhile, Rachel was leading a strategy meeting in the community center. The room was packed, with people spilling out into the hallway, all eager to contribute to the fight. "We need to approach this on multiple fronts," Rachel explained, her voice strong and clear. "Legal, political, and public opinion. We may not have Richard's money, but we have something more powerful. Our stories. Our truth." As the meeting progressed, a young law student named Michael stepped forward. "I've been doing some research," he said, his voice trembling slightly with nervousness and excitement. "I think I found something that could change everything." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "What is it, Michael?" "It's an old land transfer document," Michael explained, spreading papers on the table. "It shows that the original sale of this land to the Harrison family was fraudulent. There are signatures here that don't match up, dates that don't make sense. If we can prove this in court..." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. For the first time since the lawsuit was filed, there was a tangible sense of hope. As the day wore on, both sides prepared for the first court hearing. Rachel, armed with the newly discovered evidence and the support of her community, felt a mix of determination and fear. Richard, shaken by his sister's revelation, but unwilling to back down, doubled down on his aggressive strategy. The courthouse steps were a sea of reporters and protesters when Rachel arrived with her makeshift legal team. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Richard sat with his team of polished lawyers, exuding an air of confident disdain. Rachel and her neighbors, many dressed in their Sunday best, filled the other side of the room. As the judge called the court to order, Rachel caught Richard's eye. For a brief moment, she saw something flicker across his face. Was it doubt? Guilt? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual mask of cold indifference. The hearing began with Richard's lawyers presenting their case. They spoke of property rights, of the legal ownership that Richard held, painting the garden as an illegal squat that needed to be removed for the good of the community. When it was Rachel's turn, she stood slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the podium. But as she began to speak, her voice grew stronger, filled with the passion and pain of generations. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is about more than just a piece of land. It's about justice long denied. It's about a community fighting to preserve its heart and soul." As Rachel recounted the history of the garden, the fraudulent land deals of the past, and the importance of this space to the neighborhood, she could see the judge's expression changing. What had started as a simple property dispute was revealing itself to be something far more complex. The climax came when Michael presented the evidence of the fraudulent land transfer. Richard's lawyers scrambled to object, but the judge overruled them, allowing the documents into evidence. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge looked thoughtful. "This case," he said slowly, "is clearly more complicated than it initially appeared. I'm going to need time to review all of this new information. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks." Outside the courthouse, Rachel was mobbed by supporters and reporters. "This is just the beginning," she told the crowd, her voice ringing with determination. "We've shown that we won't be pushed aside. We'll keep fighting until justice is done." As the sun set on Maple Grove that evening, both Rachel and Richard found themselves at a crossroads. Rachel, energized by the day's small victory, knew that the hardest part of the fight was still to come. Richard, shaken by the revelations in court and haunted by his sister's words, began to question everything he had believed about his family's legacy. The battle for the garden had become a battle for the soul of Maple Grove itself. And as both sides prepared for the next round, one thing was clear: this fight was far from over. As the early morning mist clung to the streets of Maple Grove, Rachel stood at the edge of the community garden, her breath visible in the cool air. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders as she surveyed the rows of vegetables and flowers that had become the center of this tumultuous battle. "Am I doing the right thing?" she whispered to herself, doubt creeping into her voice for the first time since the lawsuit began. The initial adrenaline of the courtroom victory had faded, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that threatened to undermine her resolve. Rachel's mind drifted to the faces of her neighbors, the elderly couples who relied on the fresh produce, the children who had learned to plant their first seeds here, the immigrants who found a piece of home in the familiar herbs and vegetables. She thought of her mother and the generations before her who had poured their sweat and dreams into this soil. But with these inspiring images came the harsh realities of their situation. The legal fees were mounting, and the strain was beginning to show on everyone. Some neighbors had started to whisper about accepting Richard's offer to buy them out. The unity that had seemed so strong just days ago was showing signs of fracturing under the pressure. As if summoned by her thoughts, Mrs. Patel, one of her oldest neighbors, approached slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. "Rachel, dear," Mrs. Patel said, her voice quavering, "I've been thinking maybe we should consider Mr. Harrison's offer. I'm old and I'm tired. This fight, it might be too much for us." Rachel felt her heart sink. Mrs. Patel had been one of the garden's most ardent supporters. If she was wavering, how many others were having similar doubts? "I understand, Mrs. Patel," Rachel replied softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But this garden is our history, our future. If we give up now, we lose everything our families have fought for." Mrs. Patel nodded sadly, patting Rachel's hand. "You're a strong one, just like your mother. But strength alone might not be enough this time." As Mrs. Patel shuffled away, Rachel felt the weight of her words settle like a stone in her stomach. She knew that every day this fight continued, the pressure on her neighbors would grow. How long could they hold out against Richard's resources and influence? Across town, Richard Harrison was facing his own internal struggle. He sat in his study, a glass of expensive scotch untouched before him, staring at an old family photo. His father's stern face looked back at him, a reminder of the legacy he had always strived to uphold. But now that legacy was tainted. His sister's words echoed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. "Our family's wealth, it's built on stolen land." For the first time in his life, Richard felt the stirrings of doubt about the empire he had inherited and expanded. He had always seen himself as a self-made man, building on his father's success through his own hard work and acumen. But what if that foundation was built on injustice? A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. James Whitaker, his lead attorney, entered with a stack of papers. "Good news, Richard," Whitaker said, his voice brimming with confidence. "We found some irregularities in the community garden's permits. If we push this angle, we could have them shut down within weeks, regardless of the ongoing lawsuit." Richard stared at the papers, feeling a strange reluctance. In the past, he would have jumped at such an opportunity without hesitation. But now... "Hold off on that for now, James," he said slowly, surprising both himself and his lawyer. I need some time to consider our next move." Whitaker looked bewildered but nodded, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts once more. As the day wore on, both Rachel and Richard found themselves grappling with the consequences of their actions. Rachel visited each of her neighbors, listening to their concerns and fears, trying to rally their spirits even as her own wavered. She organized community meetings, reached out to local media, and pored over legal documents late into the night, all while the doubts continued to gnaw at her. Richard, meanwhile, found himself driving through the streets of Maple Grove, seeing the neighborhood through new eyes. He noticed the Save Our Garden signs, the worried faces of residents, the sense of community that seemed to permeate the air, all things he had dismissed before as irrelevant to his goals. As twilight fell, Rachel sat on her porch steps, exhaustion etched on her face. She closed her eyes, remembering her mother's words. "Sometimes, baby, doing the right thing is the hardest thing in the world. But that's what makes it right." In that moment, Rachel made a decision. She would see this fight through no matter the cost. The garden wasn't just about land or history. It was about standing up for what was right, about giving a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. Across town, Richard stood at his window looking out at the city lights. He picked up his phone, hesitated for a moment, then dialed his sister's number. "Sarah," he said when she answered, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. I think I need to know more about our family's history. The whole truth, not just what Dad told us." As night settled over Maple Grove, both Rachel and Richard found themselves at a crossroads. The choices they would make in the coming days would not only determine the fate of the community garden, but would force them to confront deep-seated truths about themselves and the world they lived in. The battle for Maple Grove was no longer just about a piece of land. It had become a battle for justice, for identity, and for the very soul of a community. And as both sides prepared for the next phase of this conflict, the stakes had never been higher. The garden stood silent in the moonlight, its future hanging in the balance, waiting for the dawn of a new day and the choices that would shape its destiny. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the second hearing in the Maple Grove garden case commenced. Rachel sat with her makeshift legal team, her heart pounding, but her resolve stronger than ever. Across the aisle, Richard Harrison's usual air of smug confidence seemed slightly diminished, his eyes darting nervously around the room. As the judge called the court to order, A commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. All heads turned to see an elderly man in a worn suit making his way down the aisle, assisted by a younger woman. "Your Honor," the man's voice quavered but carried a note of urgency, "I have information crucial to this case." The judge peered over his glasses. "And you are?" "Thomas Weatherby, Your Honor. I was a junior lawyer at the firm that handled the original land transfers in Maple Grove back in 1962. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Rachel's eyes widened, hope and fear warring in her chest. Richard's face had gone pale. "Mr. Weatherby," the judge said after a moment's consideration, "while this is highly irregular given the nature of this case, I'll allow you to speak. Please approach the bench." As Weatherby made his way forward, supported by the young woman, Rachel caught snippets of urgent whispers from Richard's legal team. Something big was about to happen. She could feel it in her bones. Weatherby's testimony unfolded like a bombshell, each word sending shockwaves through the courtroom. He spoke of backroom deals, of documents signed under duress, of threats made to families who refused to sell. But most damning of all, he produced a set of documents, yellowed with age but meticulously preserved, that detailed the systematic fraud used to acquire the land that now made up much of Richard Harrison's real estate empire. "I've carried the weight of this secret for decades," Weatherby said, his voice breaking. "I was young, afraid to speak up, but I can't take it to my grave. The people of Maple Grove deserve to know the truth." As Weatherby's testimony concluded, chaos erupted in the courtroom. Richard's lawyers were on their feet, objecting vehemently, while Rachel and her supporters sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of this revelation slowly sinking in. The judge, visibly shaken, called for order. "In light of this new evidence, I'm calling a recess. We'll reconvene in 1 week. I expect both parties to be prepared to address these allegations." As the courtroom emptied, Rachel found herself surrounded by a sea of reporters and well-wishers. The energy had shifted dramatically. What had seemed like an uphill battle now felt winnable. But as she fielded questions and offered cautious statements of hope, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Across town, Richard Harrison slammed the door of his study, his face a mask of rage and fear. He poured himself a large scotch, his hand shaking slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "What?" he barked. His sister Sarah entered, her face a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "I heard what happened in court today," she said softly. "Richard, it's time to face the truth. What our family did, it was wrong. We have a chance to make it right." Richard whirled on her, eyes blazing. "Make it right? Do you have any idea what this could cost us? Everything we've built, everything we are. It could all come crashing down." Sarah stood her ground. "Maybe it's time it did. Maybe we need to rebuild on a foundation of truth, not lies." As the siblings argued, the news of Weatherby's testimony spread like wildfire through Maple Grove. In homes, shops, and on street corners, people gathered to discuss this shocking turn of events. The garden, which had always been a symbol of community, now stood as a beacon of hope for justice long delayed. Rachel, exhausted but energized, returned home to find her porch crowded with neighbors. Mrs. Patel, who had wavered just days before, pressed a container of homemade food into her hands. "You keep fighting, dear," the old woman said, her eyes shining. "We're all behind you now. This isn't just about the garden anymore. It's about setting things right." As night fell over Maple Grove, both Rachel and Richard found themselves at turning points. Rachel, buoyed by the day's events but wary of counting victory too soon, began to plan their next moves. She knew that the coming days would be crucial. Public opinion was shifting, but Richard Harrison still had considerable resources at his disposal. Richard, meanwhile, paced his study long into the night. The empire he had inherited and expanded now felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through his windows, a new resolve hardened in his eyes. He wouldn't go down without a fight. The next morning, as Maple Grove awoke to a new reality, tensions were higher than ever. Rachel's phone rang early. It was Michael, the young law student who had been helping with their case. "Rachel," he said, his voice urgent, "you need to see this. Harrison's people, they're not backing down. They're launching a smear campaign against Weatherby. trying to discredit his testimony. And that's not all. There are rumors they're pressuring city officials to fast-track the garden's demolition. Lawsuit be damned. Rachel's heart sank. The battle was far from over, and it was about to get uglier than she had ever imagined. As she hung up the phone, she steeled herself for what was to come. The fight for Maple Grove's soul was entering its most critical phase, and the whole community would need to stand united if they hoped to prevail. Little did anyone know the biggest shock was yet to come. A revelation that would shake both Rachel and Richard to their cores and forever change the landscape of Maple Grove. The following days unfolded like a whirlwind in Maple Grove. Richard Harrison's PR machine roared to life, flooding local media with stories questioning Thomas Weatherby's credibility. Glossy mailers appeared in mailboxes across the neighborhood, touting the benefits of Harrison's proposed development and painting the garden supporters as obstacles to progress. Rachel found herself thrust into the spotlight like never before. Local news stations clamored for interviews, and her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters and concerned neighbors. The pressure was immense, and she felt the weight of an entire community's hopes resting on her shoulders. One crisp morning, as Rachel tended to the garden, a ritual that had become both a solace and a symbol of defiance, she noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Sarah Chen, her next-door neighbor, but something was different. Sarah's usual warm smile was replaced by a look of worry and guilt. "Rachel," Sarah began, her voice trembling. I need to tell you something. Harrison's people approached me. They offered me money, a lot of money, to speak out against the garden, to say it's become a nuisance, that we'd be better off without it." Rachel felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Sarah had been one of their staunchest supporters. If Harrison could get to her, who else might be wavering? "Did you?" Rachel couldn't bring herself to finish the question. Sarah shook her head vehemently. "No, of course not, but Rachel, they're not stopping with me. They're approaching everyone, especially those who are struggling financially. And some are considering it." The news hit Rachel like a physical blow. She had known the fight would be hard, but this felt like a new low. As she thanked Sarah for her honesty, Rachel could feel the first tendrils of doubt creeping into her mind. How long could they hold out against such tactics? Across town, Richard Harrison was facing his own crisis of conscience. The smear campaign against Weatherby left a sour taste in his mouth, but he pushed ahead, driven by a mixture of fear and pride. He couldn't let everything he'd built crumble, no matter the cost. As Richard sat in his study, poring over polling data and strategizing his next move, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Maple Grove Park, 9 p.m. Come alone. You need to see this." Intrigued and wary, Richard debated ignoring the message, but something, curiosity, fate, or perhaps a glimmer of conscience, compelled him to go. The park was deserted when Richard arrived, save for a solitary figure standing near the old oak tree at its center. As he approached, the figure turned, and Richard gasped. "Dad," he whispered, disbelief coloring his voice. The man before him was unmistakably his father, Robert Harrison, or rather a ghostly projection of him. Richard blinked hard, convinced he must be hallucinating. "Son," the apparition spoke, its voice echoing with regret. "It's time you learned the truth, the whole truth." What followed was a confession that shook Richard to his core. His father spoke of the ruthless tactics he had employed to build their real estate empire, of the families displaced, of the lives ruined. But most shocking of all was the revelation of a long-buried secret. Richard's own grandmother had been one of the displaced residents of Maple Grove, her heritage erased to protect the family's rising fortunes. "You're not just fighting against your neighbors, Richard," the ghost of Robert Harrison said, his voice fading. "You're fighting against your own blood. It's time to make this right." As the apparition vanished, Richard fell to his knees, his world turned upside down. Everything he had believed about himself, his family, his success, it was all built on a foundation of lies and injustice. Meanwhile, Rachel was facing her own moment of truth. As support for the garden began to waver under Harrison's relentless pressure, she found herself standing before a crowd of her neighbors at an emergency community meeting. "I know you're scared," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm scared too. Harrison's offering us a lot of money, and God knows many of us could use it. But this garden, it's more than just land. It's our history, our community, our future. If we give it up now, we lose a part of ourselves that we can never get back. As Rachel spoke, she could see the doubt in some eyes, the weariness in others. But there was also a spark, a growing fire of determination that spread through the room. Suddenly, the door burst open and a disheveled Richard Harrison stumbled in. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. I need to talk to Rachel, he said, his voice hoarse. Please. As the crowd parted, Richard approached Rachel, his usual confident demeanor gone. I've made a terrible mistake, he said, loud enough for all to hear. This land, it belongs to you, to all of you, and I'm going to make it right. The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, shock, disbelief, hope, and suspicion all mingling together. Rachel stood frozen, trying to process this sudden turn of events. As the night wore on and explanations were given, a new reality began to take shape in Maple Grove. The lawsuit would be dropped, the land returned to the community, and a trust established to support the garden and other community projects. But even as a tentative celebration began, Rachel knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Trust had been broken, wounds opened that would take time to heal. The true test of Maple Grove's spirit was just beginning. As dawn broke over the garden, Rachel stood among the plants her ancestors had tended, feeling the weight of history and the promise of the future. The battle for Maple Grove had taken an unexpected turn, but the war for justice and community was far from over. Little did she know the greatest challenge and the most profound transformation was yet to come, not just for her and Richard, but for the entire community of Maple Grove. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Grove as residents gathered at the courthouse for what promised to be the final hearing in the garden case. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. News vans lined the street, their antennas reaching skyward like metal trees. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Beside her, Michael, the young law student who had become an integral part of their fight, offered a reassuring smile. On the other side of the aisle, Richard Harrison sat alone, having dismissed his team of high-powered attorneys. The once imposing figure looked diminished, the weight of his family's legacy visible in the slump of his shoulders. As the judge entered and called the court to order, a hush fell over the room. Before we begin, the judge announced, I understand Mr. Harrison has a statement he wishes to make. Richard stood slowly, his eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. Faces of people he had once seen as adversaries, but now recognized as a community he had nearly destroyed. He took a deep breath and began to speak. Your Honor, residents of Maple Grove, I stand before you today not as Richard Harrison, CEO and developer, but as a man who has been blind to the truth for far too long. His voice, usually commanding, wavered with emotion as he recounted the revelations of the past weeks. The fraudulent land deals, the displaced families, and the shocking discovery of his own grandmother's connection to Maple Grove. I've spent my life building an empire on a foundation of lies and injustice, Richard continued, his voice gaining strength. Today, I'm here to tear that foundation down and help rebuild something far more valuable, a community. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Richard outlined his plan. Not only would he drop the lawsuit and return the disputed land to the community, but he would also establish a substantial trust fund to support the garden and other community projects. Furthermore, he pledged to use his resources to help identify and compensate other families who had been unjustly displaced decades ago. As Richard concluded his statement, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions, gasps of disbelief, cries of joy, and skeptical murmurs. The judge called for order, his gavel echoing through the suddenly silent room. Ms. Johnson, the judge said, turning to Rachel, do you wish to make a statement? Rachel stood, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had fought for, dreamed of, yet now that it was here, she felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, joy, but also a profound sense of responsibility. Your Honor, she began, her voice strong and clear, when we started this fight, it was about saving a garden, But along the way, we discovered it was about so much more. It was about reclaiming our history, standing up for justice, and proving that a community united can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Rachel's words resonated through the courtroom, touching hearts and stirring emotions. She spoke of the garden's significance, of the generations that had tended its soil, of the bonds forged in this struggle. "Mr. Harrison's offer is more than we could have hoped for," Rachel continued. "But our work is far from over. This garden has always been about nurturing growth, not just of plants, but of people and community. As we move forward, we must ensure that this victory becomes a catalyst for lasting change in Maple Grove." As Rachel concluded, the courtroom fell silent for a moment before erupting into applause. The judge, visibly moved, took a moment to compose himself before speaking. "In light of Mr. Harrison's statement and Ms. Johnson's response, I hereby dismiss this case. The land in question will be returned to the community of Maple Grove, with details of the trust and compensation to be worked out under the court's supervision." The gavel fell with a resounding crack and cheers filled the air. Rachel found herself enveloped in hugs from her neighbors, tears of joy streaming down many faces. As the crowd began to disperse, Rachel noticed Richard standing awkwardly to the side. Their eyes met, and after a moment's hesitation, she approached him. "Thank you," she said simply, extending her hand. Richard took it, his grip firm but his eyes filled with remorse. "No, thank you," he replied. "You've shown me what true strength and community look like. I have a lot to learn and even more to make up for." As they stood there, an unlikely pair united by an extraordinary journey, the first rays of afternoon sun broke through the courthouse windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. Outside, the news of the verdict spread rapidly through Maple Grove. Impromptu celebrations sprang up on street corners and in front yards. The community garden, the heart of this long struggle, became the focal point of a joyous gathering. As Rachel made her way there, accompanied by a jubilant crowd, she felt a profound sense of both triumph and responsibility. They had won a great victory, but the real work of healing and rebuilding was just beginning. Standing at the entrance to the garden, Rachel addressed the assembled community, her voice carrying over the excited chatter. "Today marks a new chapter for Maple Grove," she proclaimed. "We've reclaimed our past and secured our future, but let this be just the beginning. Let's use this moment to build a community where everyone has a voice, where justice prevails, and where we grow together, just like the plants in this garden." As the sun began to set on this momentous day, casting a golden glow over Maple Grove, there was a palpable sense of hope and possibility in the air. The garden stood as a testament to the power of community, resilience, and the enduring pursuit of justice. But even as celebrations continued into the night, Rachel knew that the true test lay ahead. The story of Maple Grove was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The weeks following the dramatic courtroom scene were a whirlwind of activity in Maple Grove. As news of the verdict spread, the small suburb found itself thrust into the national spotlight. Reporters flocked to the community garden, eager to capture the story of David triumphing over Goliath. On a crisp autumn morning, residents gathered at the garden for a town hall meeting. The usually quiet space was alive with chatter and anticipation. At the center of it all stood Rachel Johnson, flanked by community leaders and, surprisingly, Richard Harrison. The judge, honored as a special guest, took his place at a makeshift podium. Clearing his throat, he addressed the crowd. "Citizens of Maple Grove, we are here today to finalize the terms of the agreement between Mr. Harrison and your community. But more than that, we are here to witness a moment of healing and new beginnings." As the judge spoke, detailing the legal intricacies of the settlement, Rachel's gaze swept across the faces in the crowd. She saw Mrs. Patel, tears glistening in her eyes, Michael, the young law student, beaming with pride, and countless others who had stood by her side throughout this ordeal. The terms of the agreement were more generous than anyone had dared hope. Not only would the garden remain intact, but Richard Harrison would also fund a substantial community development project. This included affordable housing, educational programs, and resources to help identify and compensate other families who had been displaced decades ago. When it came time for Richard to speak, a hush fell over the gathering. The once imposing figure approached the podium with humility. "I stand before you today not as a businessman or a developer, but as a man seeking redemption," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion. "My family's actions caused immeasurable harm to this community. While I cannot undo the past, I am committed to being part of a better future for Maple Grove." As Richard outlined his plans for making amends, including personal involvement in community projects, the atmosphere began to shift. Skepticism gave way to cautious optimism and, in some cases, forgiveness. Rachel was the last to speak. As she took her place at the podium, she felt the weight of the moment. "Today marks not an ending but a new beginning for Maple Grove," she said, her voice strong and clear. "We have fought hard for justice, and now we must work just as hard to build the community we dream of. This garden has always been more than just plants and soil. It's a symbol of our resilience, our unity, and our shared humanity." As Rachel's words resonated through the crowd, spontaneous applause erupted. It was a cathartic release of emotions, joy, relief, and hope for the future. The official ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new plaque at the garden's entrance. It read, "Maple Grove Community Garden, where justice took root and a community blossomed." As the crowd dispersed, Rachel found herself standing next to Richard. For a moment they stood in silence, watching as children played among the flower beds and elderly residents shared stories on benches. "I never understood the value of all this," Richard said softly. "Thank you for opening my eyes." Rachel nodded, a small smile on her lips. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Harrison. We have a lot of work ahead of us." In the months that followed, Maple Grove underwent a transformation. The community garden expanded, becoming a hub for educational programs and social gatherings. Richard, true to his word, became a fixture in community meetings and volunteer efforts. The story of Maple Grove's triumph spread, inspiring other communities to stand up against injustice and fight for their shared spaces. Rachel found herself traveling to speak at conferences and rallies, sharing the lessons learned from their struggle. 1 year after the verdict, as spring bloomed in the garden, Rachel stood among the flourishing plants. She thought of her mother, of the generations that had tended this soil, and of the future generations who would benefit from their fight. A young girl approached, curiosity shining in her eyes. "Ms. Johnson," she asked, "can you tell me the story of how you saved the garden?" Rachel smiled, kneeling down to the child's level. "It's not just my story," she said warmly. "It's the story of an entire community coming together. And you know what? It's a story that's still being written, every day, by people like you." As Rachel began to recount the tale, more children gathered around. In that moment, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the promise of the future, she knew that the true legacy of their struggle was not just the garden itself, but the seeds of justice, community, and hope they had planted in the hearts of all who called Maple Grove home. The garden stood as a living testament to what can be achieved when people unite for a common cause, and a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, justice can take root and flourish.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.